Hello, I'm Dr. Nancy Wingenbach, Superintendent of the Orange City Schools, where our vision is to learn, to lead, and to make a difference. Thank you for joining us as we work to develop a shared vision of the future for Orange students. Together, we will establish systems that ensure all students are prepared for success in their lives. Again, thank you for taking the time to consider these ideas. Dr. Devers and Ms. Clark will take it from here.
Hello, welcome to this discussion on assessing and certifying competence. I am Matt Devers, Director of Educational Programs for the Orange City Schools.
And I'm Jasmine Clark, an Assistant High School Principal here in the school district. Thanks for joining us for this learning opportunity. Your thoughts and feedback will help us as we develop a shared vision for our students and their future.
This discussion about performance-based assessment systems is based on our work in the Partnership for Next Generation Learning, a group of pioneering districts and states across the country dedicated to transforming the schooling experience for all students. In performance-based systems, learners advance through programs based on their ability to demonstrate competence and knowledge and skills.
That sounds a lot like school jargon, Dr. Devers. What exactly are you talking about?
Thanks for asking, Ms. Clark. Let me give you an example from real life that you can appreciate. I know you like to travel, so let's use an example from the airline industry. This is a Boeing 747, a standard aircraft used for large domestic and international flights. I'm sure it looks familiar to you.
Yes, it does. I've logged many miles on this kind of plane.
Think about the pilots in these planes. This is clearly a situation in which competence matters. Pilots must develop and demonstrate acceptable levels of competence before they ever get to fly passengers in something like this. Pilots practice and refine their skills in this, a flight simulator. This is a pilot's classroom, where the stakes are not as high as they are with a real plane. Each time a pilot uses the simulator, it generates valuable feedback about what was done well and where improvement is needed.
I can definitely see where competence matters for pilots. So are we talking about grades like A's, B's, and C's, or are we talking about something else?
We'll talk a little later about the effectiveness of letter grades. Let's look at something we call a rubric or a scoring guide. Let's consider the aspects of quality we're probably concerned with when it comes to being a proficient pilot. In general, those aspects of quality have to do with safety checks before flying, with taxi and takeoff, and then with in-flight operations, and finally approach and landing.
I would agree that these are the general aspects of quality that go into a pilot's work. What are these labels across the top?
Those are degrees of competence. In any learning situation, we begin as a novice. With practice and guidance from teachers, we develop increasing levels of skill until we become competent. Each cell in this scoring guide would have a description, so that student pilots would understand their current levels of performance and what the next level of improvement would look like.
And sometimes we even excel at certain aspects of our work. I understand that. So why is competence so important in this idea?
Let's just pretend to describe a pilot who's competent at approach and landing. My guess is that it would be described in terms that sound like this. A competent pilot lands without assistance in all weather conditions, maintains stable flight path during deceleration in all conditions, and approaches and landings are safe and predictable.
Now that sounds like a competent pilot to me.
Take a look at the ratings for this student pilot. Would you want to go on a trip with a pilot whose skills are mostly in the developing range?
No thanks. I'll wait for the next flight. You're not getting me on that plane. Honestly, I'm even concerned with this pilot, since there is still room for needed improvement in pre-flight safety assessments.
But if you average the skills, this pilot is competent. Isn't that good enough?
Not if you want me as a passenger. The standards would have to be met across the board before I got on the plane. If I were flying with this pilot, I might even have a better experience, since some aspects of the performance excel beyond what is expected.
But that wouldn't be something you had to have, right?
Right. As long as the pilot reaches an acceptable level of competence, I feel safe and comfortable. I definitely see the importance of competence now. And since we're on the subject, I am reminded that all these people have to reach a certain level of competence before they're able to operate. They earn certificates and licenses when they reach competence.
That's right. These professionals also earn certifications that show they are competent in their work. This woman passed a competency exam and also engages in ongoing continuing education credits in order to keep her license. But all you see as a client is her certificate of competence.
Now that we're talking about it, I realize that certification is the only way most individuals progress from learner to practitioner. It makes a lot of sense.
One thing I want to point out here is that when it comes to certification in any field, competence is more important than the time it takes to reach it. We never know how long it takes someone to become a certified driver or a mechanic or a physician. All we know is they have reached an acceptable degree of competence, and we accept that.
So, why isn't that the way things work in schools?
That's an excellent question, and one we're addressing in our work in the Partnership for Next Generation Learning. Traditional schools have always been bound by time in the past. All students were expected to spend the exact same amount of time in classes. At the end of that set amount of time, students earned grades. That's the system we're all used to. Time-bound schools persist because of tradition. They're also simplest to understand and to manage. Nearly everyone thinks of school this way, and nearly everyone accepts that letter grades coming out of schools where kids are treated the same tell us something important about things we value.
That's true, but I see some limitations to this system every day in school. First of all, not everyone begins at the same level of readiness each year. Secondly, since time is a constant factor in traditional schools, excellence can sometimes be based on how students perform relative to their peers in a given class in a given school year, as opposed to how they perform relative to a standard. In reality, when we ask all students to move at the same pace, the system leaves some students bored, waiting for others to catch up. Other students become overwhelmed because they can't keep up. Treating all students the same according to some arbitrary calendar doesn't seem to make a lot of sense at the student level.
Also, there's never enough time in a time-bound system because we're so busy trying to catch some kids up while holding others back. Sometimes students end up with significant gaps in their learning, gaps which are covered up through traditional approaches to grading. Here's an example of how averaging grades over time can conceal significant gaps in achievement. Imagine an algebra course with 4 major units of study. These units might revolve around developing competence in ratios, equations, inequalities, and polynomials. First student earned very high marks in the first 3 units, but clearly has a fundamental misunderstanding of polynomials. The second student, on the other hand, excelled in 1 unit and was highly competent in all others. These students ended up with the same grade at the end of the year, but they don't have the same levels of competence in all aspects of the course.
If that polynomials unit is the equivalent of landing the airplane, we have a real problem here. It's a hard balancing act, stuffing all these ideas into classroom grades. What alternative do we have, Dr. Devers?
I'm glad you asked, Miss Clark. Let me show you one small change that could have a big impact in our programs. Imagine that instead of averaging grades regardless of competence, each unit had performance expectations spelled out in very clear terms before teaching and learning began. In this sense, each unit becomes its own single component. All the components cluster together to make credit in what used to be called an algebra class. Now imagine that each unit's expectations for performance and achievement were laid out on a scoring guide, the tool we called a rubric earlier when we were discussing airplane pilots.
I see it now. If we expected all students to reach competencies in a unit, which were clearly described in terms everyone could understand, all students would be more likely to reach standards. This would be especially helpful if each cell in the rubric had a description within it. That way everyone would know which aspects of their work needed improvement and what to do next. Also, if expectations for competency in a unit were organized around authentic, meaningful work samples like projects, performances, and problem solving, then homework and quizzes would become risk-free practice exercises designed to prepare students for success, just like the flight simulator for student pilots.
That's exactly right, Miss Clark. These performance-based systems clearly communicate expectations and standards for all students. The system also allows students to accelerate to new learning experiences once they reach acceptable levels of competence. or they can dig deeper into the content through extended investigations and applications.
In the meantime, students who do not reach performance expectations on the first try get descriptive feedback from the scoring guide telling them where improvement is needed. One thing this system wouldn't be able to do is guarantee that all students are in the same classroom at all times across a given school year. That may not be such a bad thing.
We see this as a way to give students and parents high-quality feedback about performance and growth from their earliest school experiences in elementary school to the way we guide students through challenging work as they develop their knowledge and skills,
to when we finally certify their competence with a diploma that shows they have mastered world-class knowledge and skills here in the district. I understand, and it seems to make a lot of sense. What happens when students want to apply to a university? Will colleges accept marks from such a non-traditional system?
That's a great question. Some school districts have already addressed that. By aligning performance expectations with quality points, schools can convert scores on rubrics across a given course into the kinds of marks universities are used to seeing, like grade point averages.
From the outside, things would look similar. Internally, we would have created a system where success for students is the only option. That is a lot of information and some great new ideas. I guess the next question is, would this system help ensure student success? Would this system increase awareness of expectations and performance for all students?
And along those same lines, the real question is, would this system accommodate individual differences in style and pace of learning better than the system we have now? These are all very important questions to consider. I look forward to hearing feedback from stakeholders in the school community about how a system like this might better meet the needs of all students. Thanks a lot for considering these ideas and joining in the conversation. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. Goodbye.
Goodbye.